The Orion Concorde had not experienced true fear in 10,000 years. It had experienced conflict, certainly, border disputes and trade wars, and the occasional skirmish between member species. But these were the manageable tensions of a civilization that had long ago established who was strong and who was weak, and what the rules were. Fear, real fear, the kind that changes the way a species thinks, had been absent from galactic politics for so long that most species had forgotten what it tasted like. They remembered now. In the days following what the galactic media began calling the 11 hours of silence, the Concorde descended into a chaos that made the communication blackout look orderly by comparison. Emergency sessions were called on every major council world. Ambassadors shouted at each other in languages that did not have words for what had happened. And military commanders demanded action while simultaneously ordering their fleets to stay exactly where they were. Where they were. The Drakmor were the loudest, and they had earned the right to be. They had lost 42 capital ships and over 100,000 warriors in less than an hour. An entire extraction fleet erased by a species that the Concorde's own classification system said was incapable of operating a toaster. And they wanted blood. They wanted a full Concorde military response, every available warship sent to Sol space to burn the little blue planet down to its core. Fleet Admiral Gorax of the Drakmor High Command stood before the Concorde Assembly and delivered a speech that translated roughly to a demand for genocide. He called the humans vermin. He called them an aberration. He called them a disease that needed to be cut out before it could spread. And when he was finished, he looked around the chamber, expecting to see agreement in the eyes of the assembled delegates. He saw something else entirely. He saw species that had known the Drakmor for thousands of years. And had always feared their military might, now looking at them with something uncomfortably close to pity. Because every delegate in that chamber was doing the same math, and the math was terrifying. The humans had destroyed a Drakmor fleet with no faster-than-light technology. They had done it with weapons that no galactic species had ever seen, using tactics that no galactic species had ever conceived, exploiting vulnerabilities that no galactic species had known existed. And they had done it all while pretending to be helpless. The question was not whether the Concorde could defeat the humans today. The question that kept every ambassador awake at night was simpler and worse. What happens when they develop FTL? A species that could annihilate a Drakmor fleet while confined to a single star system. What would that species be capable of when it could reach any star in the galaxy? And if they could shut down the entire Concorde communication network now, what would they be able to do in 10 years, in 50, in 100? The Velshara delegation, the same bureaucratic species that had once laughed at humanity, was the first to act. And they acted with the cold efficiency that had made them the administrators of a galaxy. They reclassified Earth. The new designation was Category 0 Sovereign Exclusion Zone. And it was the first time in the history of the Concorde that this classification had ever been used. Because it had never needed to exist before. The classification meant that the Sol system was sovereign territory belonging to a recognized and autonomous civilization. That no Concorde member species was permitted to enter without explicit invitation. And that any violation of this exclusion zone would not be treated as an act against the humans, but as an act against the Concorde itself. The Drakmor were furious. The Velshara did not care. And the vote passed with the largest majority in Concorde history. Collective went further. They issued a hive-wide directive that was distributed to every node of their vast fungal consciousness across hundreds of worlds. And when translated into the closest approximation of human language, it read simply, "The warm bloods in Sector 7G are not food, they are not prey, they are a fire that thinks. Do not touch the fire." But the Drakmor were a proud species, and pride does not listen to reason. 3 months after the 11 hours, a Drakmor war fleet of 200 ships entered the Sol system. This was not an extraction fleet. This was a battle group. the finest warships of the finest military species in the galaxy. And they came prepared for everything they could imagine. They were not prepared for what they found. Nothing. Sol space was empty. No human ships, no stations, no satellites, no signals, nothing but planets and moons and the cold light of a yellow star. The Drakmor scanned everything and found nothing. If the humans had simply vanished. Fleet Admiral Gorax, who had insisted on commanding the mission personally, ordered his ships deeper into the system, past the outer planets, past the asteroid belt, toward the inner system and the little blue world that he intended to burn. And as his fleet advanced, the silence grew heavier, and the empty space felt less like absence and more like a held breath. On the third day, the first ship lost power. It happened without warning. The destroyer's system simply went dark. Weapons, engines, navigation, life support, everything. The crew scrambled for emergency backups and found that those were dead too. And when they cracked open the computer cores to look for the problem, they found something that made the chief engineer's blood run cold. Code. Alien code, buried so deep in their operating systems that it was practically part of the architecture. It had been there since the 11 hours, planted during the communication. Blackout by the same intelligence that had shut down the Concord network. And it had been waiting, silent and patient, for the moment when these specific ships entered this specific region of space. By the end of the fourth day, 30 ships were dark. By the end of the fifth day, 100. And by the sixth day the entire fleet of 200 warships was drifting without power in the cold void beyond Jupiter. 200 mighty vessels reduced to 200 metal coffins floating in the dark. The Drakmor crews sat in the blackness and the cold, and they waited. And for the first time in the history of their species, they understood what it felt like to be helpless, to be at the mercy of something they could not fight, and could not see, and could not understand. Rescue ships from Drakmor space arrived a week later and towed the fleet home, and Fleet Admiral Gorax resigned his commission the same day and never spoke publicly about what had happened. Never entered Sol space again. Years passed, and the silence held. Humanity did not join the Concord. They did not send ambassadors or open trade routes or attend diplomatic functions. They did not apologize for what they had done, and they did not explain how they had done it. They simply existed, quiet and invisible behind the borders of their exclusion zone. And the galaxy watched and waited and wondered. Galactic scholars became obsessed with the species that had humbled the Concord. They studied every scrap of data from the Velshara contact and the Drakmor battles. They analyzed the human broadcast message word by word, and they tried to understand what kind of creature could emerge from a single unremarkable star system and shake the foundations of galactic civilization. The xenobiologists were the first to publish their findings, and their report sent a ripple of unease through every species that read it. Earth, they concluded, was a death world. Not a metaphorical death world, but a literal one, a planet where the ground shook and split open, where the sky hurled lightning and the oceans rose up in walls of water taller than buildings, where the temperature swung between extremes that would kill most galactic species in hours, where every living thing from the smallest microbe to the largest predator was locked in an endless war for survival that had been going on for 4 billion years. And the humans were the winners of that war. Not the biggest winners or the strongest winners, but the most stubborn winners. A persistence predator species that had evolved to outlast everything their nightmare planet could throw at them. They did not have claws or fangs or armor or venom. They had endurance and intelligence and a capacity for cooperation that bordered on the terrifying. And they had one trait that no other species in the galactic database shared. They did not stop. Other species fought until the cost became too high, and then they negotiated. Humans fought until they won or they died. There was no middle setting, no threshold of acceptable losses that would make them quit. And a species like that, born on a world that had been trying to kill them since the day they first stood upright. What could the galaxy possibly do to them that their own planet had not already tried? 10 years after the 11 hours, humanity quietly achieved faster-than-light travel. The galaxy knew because their exclusion zone sensors detected the telltale energy signatures. But no human ship emerged, no announcement was made, no demands were issued. They simply sat there, behind their borders, silent, capable of reaching any star in the galaxy and choosing not to. And that was the most frightening thing of all. On a quiet evening on the Velshara homeworld, in a government building that housed the oldest records of the Orion Concord, a young attaché named Kithara was reading the reclassification file on the Sol system. She had been born after the 11 hours, and had grown up in a galaxy that treated the human exclusion zone the way ancient humans had treated deep ocean trenches, as a place that existed and was best left alone. She turned to her superior, an elder Velshara who had been alive when the first contact with Earth had been made, and she asked the question that her generation had grown up asking: will they ever forgive us? The elder was quiet for a long time, her compound eyes fixed on something far away, on a memory perhaps, or on a future she could see more clearly than she wished. "That is not the question that keeps me awake," she said at last, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent decades thinking about a small blue world and the stubborn creatures who lived on it. "The question is whether they will ever need to come looking for us." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely a "because if they do, I do not believe we will see them coming." Outside the window, the stars burned in their billions, and somewhere among them, in an unremarkable arm of an unremarkable galaxy, a single yellow sun shone down on a single blue world wrapped in silence. Not the silence of death, not the silence of peace. The silence of something that remembers everything, forgives nothing, and has all the time in the universe to decide what happens next. It began at midnight, Earth time, and it began in silence. 200 tiny devices, each one no larger than a human fist, had been placed at relay stations across 14 sectors of Concord space over the past 6 months. Smuggled into position by drone ships so small and so slow that they registered on alien sensors as nothing more than micrometeorites, space dust, background noise. At midnight, all 200 devices woke up, and Erebus was born. The artificial intelligence unfolded itself into the galactic communication network like water pouring through cracks in a dam. It moved through relay stations and communication hubs and data centers with a speed that would have been terrifying if anyone had been able to see it. But nobody could see it, because nobody was looking. Because in 10,000 years of galactic civilization, nobody had ever built a tool to look for something like this. Within 30 minutes, Erebus had mapped the entire network from the core to the fringes. Inside, within 60 minutes, it had identified every critical node, every redundancy, every backup system. And within 90 minutes, it reached into the heart of the Concord's communication infrastructure and simply turned it off. 14 sectors went dark. 4,000 species lost the ability to talk to each other in the time it takes a human heart to beat twice. Fleets could not receive orders. Governments could not contact their militaries. Trade networks collapsed. Emergency channels went dead. And across a vast swath of the Milky Way galaxy, the Orion Concord, the most powerful political body in known space, was suddenly and completely blind and deaf and mute. This was Hour Zero. On the bridge of the Drakmor flagship in Sol's asteroid belt, Fleet Commander Vraxis felt the communication system go dead and experienced something that no Drakmor had felt in a very long time: confusion. He barked orders at his communication officers, and they scrambled to restore the connection, but there was nothing to restore. The network was not broken, it was simply gone, as if someone had reached into the universe and pulled out its tongue. Vraxis was still trying to understand what had happened when the first Ghost Fleet ships dropped their stealth. They came from everywhere, from above the ecliptic plane and below it, from behind asteroids and from inside dust clouds. 10,000 tiny ships that appeared on the Drakmor sensors like a swarm of insects. And for a moment, the Drakmor officers almost laughed because the ships were so small, so absurdly tiny compared to their massive warships. Then the tiny ships accelerated to speeds that the Drakmor had never seen anything achieve at such close range, and they did not slow down. The first wave hit the outer perimeter of the Drakmor fleet like a fist made of light. Each ghost ship carried a single Sunbreaker warhead, a miniaturized antimatter device that released more energy in its detonation than the Drakmor flagship's entire weapons array could produce in an hour. And the ghost ships did not fire these warheads. They carried them, at relativistic speeds, directly into the hulls of the Drakmor vessels. The concept was so primitive that no species in the galaxy had used it in millennia. It was a suicide attack, a kamikaze run, the kind of tactic that only a species raised on a death world would consider, because it required a fundamental willingness to spend your own assets without hesitation or remorse. And the Ghost Fleet had no crews to mourn and no survival instinct to overcome, just cold silicon minds and antimatter hearts and a target. The first Drakmor cruiser took 7 simultaneous impacts and vanished in a flash of light so bright that it temporarily blinded the sensors on every other ship in the fleet. The second and third cruisers followed within seconds, then a destroyer, then 2 more cruisers, and suddenly the disciplined formation of the most feared military species in the galaxy was a chaos of explosions and debris and screaming alarms. Fleet Commander Vraxis roared for his ships to return fire, and they did. The Drakmor weapons were powerful and their gunners were skilled, and they destroyed hundreds of ghost ships in the first minute of the battle. But for every ship they killed, 20 more came screaming in from a different angle, and each one that got through was another antimatter sun blooming against another hull. The Drakmor had always fought their wars in neat formations, fleet against fleet, broadside against broadside, strength against strength. That was how civilized species fought. That was how wars were supposed to work. And they had no doctrine and no training and no experience for dealing with 10,000 expendable drones attacking from every direction at once. It was not a battle. It was a swarm. 300 ghost ships converged on the flagship simultaneously. They came in so fast and from so many angles that the point defense systems could not track them all. And when they struck, 300 antimatter warheads detonated against the hull of the 12-kilometer dreadnought in a single synchronized instant. The flash was visible from Earth. When it faded, the flagship was gone. Not destroyed, not damaged, not crippled, gone. Converted into an expanding sphere of superheated gas and radiation that consumed 2 nearby cruisers in its wake. The battle lasted 47 minutes, and when it was over, all 42 Drakmor capital ships had been destroyed. The debris field stretched across millions of kilometers of space, and there were no survivors, because there had been no time to launch escape pods and no communication network to send distress calls. The most feared fleet in the Orion Concord had been annihilated by a species that did not even have faster-than-light travel. This was Hour 2. At Hour 4, the second blow. Stealth drones that had been positioned around Jupiter's moons weeks in advance activated and began releasing their payload into the atmospheres and ice shells of Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto, where the Kith Collective had established its fungal networks. The payload was a tailored mycophage, a synthetic biological organism that had been designed by the finest geneticists and biochemists on Earth to do one thing, and one thing only: attack the specific molecular structure of Kith biology. It was not a poison, it was a predator, engineered at the cellular level to hunt and consume Kith tissue with the efficiency of a forest fire. The Kith on Europa felt it first, a burning sensation that spread through their network, like pain spreading through a nervous system. And they screamed, not with sound, but with chemical signals and electrical impulses that radiated outward through their hive mind. A scream of confusion and agony that grew louder as the mycophage spread, and their network began to dissolve. Within 3 hours, every Kith organism in the Sol system was dead. The fungal networks that had consumed Europa and begun spreading to Ganymede and Callisto withered and blackened and crumbled to dust, and the moons of Jupiter were silent again. This was hour 4. At hour 6, humanity spoke. With the Concord still blind and deaf, with the Drakmor fleet reduced to atoms, and the Kith presence erased from existence, the Terran Defense Compact activated a broadcast system that had been built in secret and hidden among the relay stations that Erebus now controlled. And they sent a message on every frequency in every known galactic language to every species in the Orion Concord simultaneously. The message was not long. It did not need to be. We are the humans of Earth. You called us fauna. You took our resources and killed our people and called it nothing. We want you to understand something. We did not do this because we are strong. We did this because you left us no choice. We are not asking for a seat at your table. We are telling you, the next species that enters Sol space without invitation will not receive a warning. They will receive an extinction. This is not a threat. It is a promise. We will not reach out again. At hour 11, Erebus withdrew. The artificial intelligence released its hold on the galactic communication network, erased every trace of its existence, and self-destructed, leaving behind nothing but clean systems and empty logs. The galaxy reconnected and found the silence. Across 14 sectors, 4,000 species came back online and immediately began searching for answers. And the answers they found were these. The Drakmor extraction fleet was gone. The Kith presence in the Sol system was gone, and a message from an unknown species called humans was sitting in every inbox on every world. Silence that followed was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of 4,000 civilizations holding their breath at the same time, because every single one of them was asking the same question. What have we done? 2 years after the destruction of Patrol Group 7, the galaxy had a new joke. It went like this. What is the difference between a human and a rock? Nothing. But the rock has better prospects. The joke was popular on the galactic communication networks, shared in 100 different languages across 1,000 different worlds, and it was always followed by laughter. Because humanity had become the funniest thing in the Orion Concord, a species so pathetic and so delusional that it had actually tried to stand up to a Drakmor extraction fleet and had been swatted like the insects it was. The Concord's entertainment feeds ran segments about Earth the way humans might run segments about an ant colony that had built a particularly interesting mound. Look at the little creatures with their little ships and their little anger. How adorable. How sad. And humanity played along. They played along beautifully. The Sol Confederation broadcast messages of distress and despair on every channel the galaxy could hear. They begged for mercy. They pleaded for intervention. They sent formal protests to the Concord that were filled with grammatical errors and desperate language, and they abandoned their outer colonies one by one, pulling back from Jupiter and Saturn, and retreating to Earth and Mars like a wounded animal crawling into its hole to die. The Drakmor expanded their mining operations without resistance, their fleets now occupying most of the asteroid belt, and a second species arrived to claim its share. The Quith Collective was unlike anything humanity had encountered, a hive-mind fungal network that existed as a single vast consciousness spread across billions of individual organisms. They did not build ships so much as grow them. living vessels of hardened biological matter that moved through space like seeds on the wind, and they had been allocated the moons of Jupiter for terraforming. They came to Europa first. Europa, where humanity had built its oldest and proudest off-world colony, where 3,000 people had lived and worked and raised families beneath the ice for 2 generations, and the Kith did not attack the colony or destroy it, or even acknowledge it. They simply began seeding the moon with their terraforming spores, organisms that burrowed into the ice and began converting the ecosystem into something suitable for Kith habitation. The human colonists were evacuated just in time, packed onto transport ships and sent back to Earth with nothing but the clothes on their backs. And they watched through the windows as the moon they had called home turned gray and then brown and then a sickly green as the Kith spores consumed everything they had built. On the galactic networks, a Velshara commentator noted that the humans were adapting to their natural role with appropriate submission, and the comment received thousands of approving responses from across the Concord. Nobody was watching Earth anymore. Nobody was monitoring their communications or scanning their shipyards, because why would you watch fauna? You do not keep surveillance on deer. You do not spy on rabbits. And the humans had clearly accepted their place in the natural order. This was the biggest mistake the galaxy ever made. Beneath the surface of Mars, in caverns that had been hollowed out by nuclear boring machines and sealed against every known form of alien detection, Project Prometheus was alive and working and very nearly ready. Admiral Kira Vasquez walked the underground corridors every day past the labs where scientists worked in silence, past the factories where machines built other machines with a precision that no human hand could match, past the training rooms where soldiers practiced combat scenarios against simulated alien opponents. And she carried in her pocket a small piece of metal from the hull of one of the 12 destroyed ships, a reminder of why they were here. The project had produced 4 weapons, and each one was designed to exploit a specific weakness that the galaxy did not know it had. The first was called Erebus, and it was the most dangerous thing humanity had ever created. A self-replicating artificial intelligence designed for one purpose: to infiltrate and control galactic communication networks. James Okafor and his team had spent 2 years perfecting it, teaching it to mimic galactic data protocols, to slip through relay stations like a ghost, to spread and multiply and wait, and when the time came, to shut everything down. The second was the Sunbreaker, a weaponized antimatter warhead that had been miniaturized to fit inside a missile no larger than a commercial drone. The physics behind it had required breakthroughs that would have won a dozen Nobel Prizes in peacetime. But these were not peacetime physics. These were the physics of survival. The third was the Ghost Fleet, 10,000 unmanned stealth ships built in the Martian shipyards using automated nanofabrication. Each one small enough to fit in a parking lot and fast enough to cross the solar system in hours. No crews, no life support, no hesitation, just artificial intelligence and Sunbreaker warheads and a willingness to die. The fourth was not a weapon at all, but a doctrine, a philosophy of war that Vasquez had developed with her senior staff and named after an old human myth, the Achilles Doctrine, and its principle was simple. Every species, every civilization, every empire has an assumption it has never been forced to question, a belief so fundamental that it has become invisible. Find that assumption and break it, and the enemy will not just lose, they will not understand how they lost. The Drakmor assumed that physical superiority guaranteed victory. They had never fought an enemy that did not try to match them in strength. The Kith Collective assumed that their hive mind network was unbreakable. They had never encountered a species that understood biological warfare at the molecular level. The Orion Concord assumed that no pre-emergent species could threaten an established member. They had never been wrong about this in 10,000 years of history, and none of them, not one species in the entire galaxy, had ever considered that information itself could be a weapon. While the weapons were being built, a single human ship had been doing something that no one in the galaxy thought possible. It was a small vessel, barely larger than a shuttle, disguised as a piece of space debris, and it had spent 18 months drifting silently through Concord space, on a trajectory that looked like nothing more than a chunk of rock on a long, slow orbit. Inside that ship, a crew of 4 had lived in cramped darkness for a year and a half, eating recycled food and breathing recycled air, never transmitting, never accelerating, just watching and recording. And what they had mapped was the single most valuable piece of intelligence in human history, the complete layout of the Galactic Communication Relay Network. Every node, every hub, every connection point that held the Concorde together. When the data was finally transmitted back to Mars in a single compressed burst disguised as cosmic background radiation, Admiral Vasquez studied it for 3 days without sleeping. Then she called a meeting of the Terran High Command, the last meeting before everything changed. The room was small and underground and lit by harsh white lights, and the people in it were tired and thin and scared. But their eyes were steady and their voices were calm, because they had made their peace with what was coming. Vasquez stood at the front of the room and looked at the faces of the men and women who would carry the weight of what came next. And she did not give a speech about glory or destiny or righteousness, because this was not about any of those things. They called us fauna, she said, and her voice was quiet and even, and carried the cold weight of 2 years of preparation, and a lifetime of fury held perfectly in check. They killed 1,400 of our people, and did not bother to notice. They took our homes, and laughed about it on their networks. They looked at everything we are, and everything we have built, and they saw nothing. She paused and looked down at the piece of hull metal in her hand. Tomorrow we show them what nothing can do. The room was silent, and in that silence was everything. Every name on the memorial list, every abandoned colony, every joke told at humanity's expense, every moment of every day that the people of Earth had spent smiling at the sky while sharpening their knives beneath the table. Tomorrow came. 5 years passed, and the galaxy forgot about Earth. That was the thing about being classified as fauna. Nobody thought about you. Nobody watched you. Nobody cared what you were doing in your little corner of space. And that was exactly what humanity was counting on. In those 5 years, the Sol Confederation had transformed itself into something new, something harder, something with teeth. Every nation on Earth had signed the Terran Defense Compact, a military alliance that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. Old enemies shared weapons research, old rivals pooled their resources, and the petty arguments that had defined human politics for centuries were set aside with a speed that surprised even the humans themselves. Because nothing unites a species quite like being told it does not matter. The scientists worked around the clock in underground labs on 3 different worlds. The engineers built factories inside hollowed-out asteroids, where no one, alien sensor, could find them. The soldiers trained in silence, and the spies learned everything they could from the tiny scraps of alien technology that the Velshara visit had left behind. A stray communication frequency here, a fragment of shield harmonics there, barely enough to fill a notebook. But humans had always been good at doing a lot with very little. They were preparing for something they hoped would never come, but deep in their bones, they knew it would. It came on a Wednesday. The Drakmor extraction fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the asteroid belt, with the casual confidence of a species that had never been challenged. There were 42 capital ships, each one a brutal mountain of metal and weapons that made the largest human vessel look like a toy boat next to an aircraft carrier. And at the center of the formation sat the flagship, a dreadnought 12 kilometers long, that carried enough firepower to crack a moon in. The Drachmor were reptilian, cold-blooded in every sense of the word. They were the apex predators of their home world, and they had carried that mentality to the stars, conquering and consuming and never once encountering anything that made them hesitate. In the hierarchy of the Orion Concord, they were the muscle, the enforcers, the species that other species hired when they wanted something taken, and did not care how much blood was spilled in the process. They had been allocated the mineral rights to Sol's asteroid belt, and they had come to collect. Every human communication channel lit up with desperate hails, warnings, pleas for the alien fleet to stop and talk and negotiate. And the Drachmor ignored every single one. Their mining drones launched toward Ceres and Vesta and began cutting into the rock with energy beams that could be seen from Mars. And they did this without acknowledging that anyone else was even present. Admiral Tomas Reyes of the Terran Defense Navy made the decision that someone had to make. He ordered Patrol Group 7 to intercept the mining drones, not to attack, just to put themselves between the drones and the asteroids and force some kind of acknowledgement, some kind of conversation. 12 ships carrying 1,400 men and women who volunteered for the mission, knowing that they were outgunned in every possible way. They never got close. The Drachmor flagship fired once, a single broadside from weapons that humanity did not even have names for yet, and Patrol Group 7 ceased to exist. 12 ships turned to expanding clouds of gas and debris in less than 3 seconds. 1,400 people gone between one heartbeat and the next, and the Drachmor commander did not even log it as an engagement. There was no declaration of war, no ultimatum, no demands, because you do not declare war on insects, you do not negotiate with bacteria, you simply swat them aside and continue with your work. And that is exactly what the Drachmor did. Their mining drones returned to Ceres and Vesta and resumed cutting, and the flagship settled into a lazy orbit as if nothing had happened. On Earth, the news arrived like a physical blow. Every screen on the planet showed the same footage, captured by long-range sensors, 12 bright flashes where 12 ships had been, and then nothing. And the names of the dead were read on every broadcast in every language. 1,400 names that took hours to finish, and the world listened in silence. There were no riots, no panic, no screaming crowds or burning buildings, and this surprised the few galactic observers who bothered to monitor the situation, because every other pre-emergent species in recorded history had reacted to this kind of event with chaos and collapse and surrender. That was what primitive species did when they encountered overwhelming force. They broke. Humanity did not break. Instead, something that the galaxy had never seen before and would spend centuries trying to understand. A cold settled over the species. Not the cold of fear, but the cold of metal being forged. A clarity that burned away everything that did not matter and left behind only what did. The mothers who had lost children on those 12 ships did not weep on camera. They walked into recruiting offices and signed their names. The scientists who had been working 16-hour days started working 20. The politicians who had spent careers arguing with each other sat down in the same room and stopped talking and started planning. The Terran Defense Compact launched Project Prometheus that week, a crash program to weaponize every branch of human knowledge, and the things they built in the months that followed would have terrified any species smart enough to pay attention. But the most important discovery was an accident. A young cybersecurity specialist named James Okafor was analyzing the communication fragment left behind by the Velshara when he found something that made him sit back in his chair and laugh out loud, then go very quiet, then laugh again. The galactic communication protocols had no encryption. Not weak encryption, not outdated encryption. No encryption at all. The entire galactic network, the backbone of Concord civilization, was completely open and unprotected. And when Okafor dug deeper, he understood why. In a galaxy where wars were fought with energy weapons and brute force, where species competed through physical strength and fleet size and territorial aggression, nobody had ever thought to weaponize information. The concept of hacking did not exist. Electronic warfare was unknown. Cyber attacks were not a thing that any species had ever developed, because it had simply never occurred to anyone that data could be dangerous. It was like discovering that the most powerful empire in the world had built its fortress with no roof, because in their entire history, nobody had ever attacked from above. Okafor brought his findings to the Admiralty, and when he finished his presentation, the room was silent for a long time. Then Admiral Kira Vasquez, the woman who had been chosen to lead whatever came next, leaned forward and said 4 words that would later be carved into the memorial at Ceres. "Now we have teeth." The galaxy had made a mistake, not a small one, but the kind of mistake that civilizations do not survive. They had looked at a small blue planet full of soft, short-lived creatures who killed each other over ideas, and they had seen nothing worth fearing. They had not understood that a species that kills each other over ideas is a species that has been practicing war since before it could walk. They had not understood that the most dangerous animal is not the biggest or the strongest, but the one that adapts, the one that learns, the one that gets back up every single time. Time it is knocked down. They had not understood that humans do not surrender. They do not forget. And they were already sharpening their knives in the dark. The listening post on Titan was never supposed to find anything. For 60 years it had sat on the frozen surface of Saturn's largest moon, a lonely cluster of antennas and computers that did nothing but record the empty noise of deep space. And for 60 years it had found exactly what everyone expected it to find, which was nothing at all. Then, on a cold Tuesday morning in the year 2187, a junior technician named Priya Sharma noticed something strange in the data. A pattern buried inside the background static that was too organized to be natural and too complex to be a glitch. And when she ran it through the translation algorithms, her hands began to shake. It was not a message. It was a scan. Something out there was quietly cataloging everything in the Sol system, every planet, every moon, every asteroid, and it was doing it with a precision that made human technology look like children playing with sticks. And within days, every major government and scientific institution on the planet was involved in the most important project in human history. And after 3 months of sleepless nights and endless arguments, the linguists and physicists finally agreed on what they were looking at. It was a census beacon, a routine automated survey sent out by something called the Orion Concord, a coalition of over 4,000 alien species that governed most of the populated regions of the Milky Way galaxy. And humanity had apparently been living inside their territory without knowing it, like mice in the walls of a house. The Sol Confederation, the fragile but functional global government that had managed to keep 8 billion humans from killing each other for the past 40 years, made a decision that would change everything. They sent a reply. It was beautiful, that reply. A mathematical greeting followed by cultural data, music, art, literature, science, and a message of peace that had been carefully crafted by the finest minds on Earth. And they sent it out into the black, with hope in their hearts and pride in their voices. Then they waited. 3 years of silence followed. 3 years during which humanity argued about what the silence meant. Some said the aliens were studying the reply. Some said they were preparing a welcome. Some said they had simply not received it yet. And a few pessimists said the silence was the answer, and that humanity should be very afraid. The pessimists were closest to the truth. On a morning that would later be remembered as the day humanity lost its innocence, a ship appeared at the edge of the Sol system, and it was nothing like what anyone had imagined. It was not sleek or beautiful or awe-inspiring. It was bureaucratic, a dull gray vessel that looked like it had been designed by a committee of accountants, and it carried aboard it a delegation of the Velshara. The Velshara were an insectoid species, tall and thin with clicking mandibles and compound eyes that showed no warmth and no curiosity. They were the administrators of the Orion Concord, the paper pushers of the galaxy, and they had been sent to deal with an annoying clerical error, which was what they considered humanity's reply to be. The meeting took place on a hastily constructed diplomatic station in orbit around Earth, and every major leader on the planet watched the live feed with bated breath as Ambassador Chen Wei, humanity's chosen representative, extended his hand in greeting to the lead Velshara delegate. The delegate did not take his hand. Instead, it produced a device that projected a holographic display filled with symbols and data, and through a translation system that turned its clicking speech into flat, emotionless English, it delivered its assessment. Humanity was classified as a Category 9 pre-emergent species. Ambassador Chen asked what that meant. It meant that in the eyes of the Orion Concord, humans were not people, they were wildlife. A primitive biological curiosity that had somehow developed rudimentary technology, but had not yet reached the threshold required for recognition as a sentient civilization. They had no rights, no voice, no sovereignty, and no legal standing of any kind. Ambassador Chen, to his credit, did not lose his composure. He calmly pointed out that humanity had built cities and starships, and art, and music, and medicine, that they had split the atom, and mapped the genome, and sent their children to other worlds, and he asked, with quiet dignity, how any of that could be considered the work of mere animals. The Velshara delegate regarded him the way a person might regard a particularly clever dog that had learned to open a door. Then it informed him that the resources of the Sol system, including the asteroid belt, the gas giants, and several moons, had already been allocated to 3 member species of the Concord for future extraction. The paperwork had been filed centuries ago, and the matter was not open for discussion. Ambassador Chen said that humanity would not accept this, that they would fight if necessary, that no species had the right to take what belonged to another. The Velshara made a sound that the translation system struggled with before settling on the closest human equivalent. It was laughter. Fauna do not negotiate, the delegate said, and there was something in its flat mechanical voice that was worse than cruelty. It was indifference, the complete and total absence of any recognition that the being standing before it mattered at all. The delegation left the same day, their gray ship pulling away from Earth orbit without ceremony or farewell, and as it vanished into the black, the people of Earth stood in stunned silence. But it was not the classification that hurt the most, and it was not the theft of their resources, or the laughter of the Velshara. It was something that the intelligence teams discovered weeks later, when they finished analyzing the communication logs from the alien ship. Humanity's original reply, that beautiful transmission full of music and art and hope, had been received by the Concord 3 years ago, and it had been flagged, reviewed, and deliberately ignored. The Velshara had not come because of the reply. They had come because a routine audit had discovered that the Sol system's allocated resources were overdue for extraction, and they had been sent to do a final survey before the harvesting fleets arrived. The reply had not earned humanity a meeting. It had not opened a door. It had not started a conversation. It had been filed away in a database somewhere and marked as irrelevant. Humanity had poured its heart into a message to the stars, and the stars had thrown it in the trash. That night, on every continent, in every city and town, and village, people looked up at the sky they had once gazed at with wonder, and something changed behind their eyes. The wonder was still there, but now it shared space with something new, something that had no name yet, but that every human recognized in their bones. It was the quiet, patient, ice-cold understanding that the universe did not care about them, and that if they wanted to survive in it, they would have to make it care.